This is good tonight. I don't mean me, I mean the stuff. I don't believe we talked about verses, check this, perhaps yes, we ended at verse 17, did we not? Of chapter 2?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay, so you remember what I said about that. And did I? Okay, verse 18 marks a transition. It is a transition. Up to this point, what we've had is theological explication. He's been given a theological background for the superiority of Christ of the new covenant over the old covenant, because of the superiority of Christ over the superiority of others. Okay? Wait, I'm confused as to where we are. I thought I had talked about Moses. No? Okay, I'll do it. All right. If this sounds familiar, tell me. Anyhow, verse 18, yes. This is the transitional verse. Wherefore, holy brethren, verse 3, partakers of the heavenly calling, consider the apostle and high priest of our profession, Christ Jesus. We have made apostle into the term for the 12, the most important disciples of Jesus. And so everybody, I think, probably knows that its definition, apostolos in the Greek, is a messenger, one who is sent on a messenger. But it does have a secondary meaning, and it's a meaning that's very much alive. That is someone, an envoy, a delegate, someone sent on a mission, someone who is commissioned by a higher authority to represent that higher authority in some way. Here's a good example of how it's still alive in that sense. Because the Holy See, that is, the Pope and his pals, because the Holy See is not actually a state. The Vatican is the state. The Holy See is something different. Because the Holy See is not actually a state, it cannot send ambassadors to governments. Therefore, it sends another type of delegate. Same powers, but different title. And the title is Apostolic Nuncio. Nuncio means messenger. So you wouldn't say messenger. It means envoy messenger, delegate messenger. Someone who is sent not just with a message, not just someone who's sent to hand over a document or speak a word, but someone who is empowered to speak for the higher authority. It's the only time in the New Testament that this term, apostle, is applied to Jesus. Very interesting, I think. Very interesting. Who was faithful to him that appointed him, as also Moses was faithful in all his house. I think the his here applies not to Moses, but to God. Okay? In other words, Moses was faithful in his mission to the people of Israel. For this man was counted worthy of more glory than Moses, inasmuch as he who hath builded the house hath more honor than the house. It's interesting, and I think significant, that he doesn't refer to Jesus by name here. He refers to him as this man. It seems to me the intention here is to focus the interest on Jesus' identity as on his human identity rather than his divine nature. It's an emphasis on the humanity of Christ. For every house is builded by some man, but he that built all things is God. Now, once again, this is emphasizing the role of the second person of the Trinity in creation. By him all things were made. We say it every Sunday. And the argument is that Jesus is more worthy than Moses because he is the builder of the house, that is God, thus emphasizing his divinity over his humanity. The idea that, as I mentioned before, fairly vigorously, the idea that the divinity of Christ is a late development in Christian theology is absolutely absurd. It is there from the very beginning. And Moses verily was faithful in all his house as a servant, for a testimony of those things which were to be spoken after. The word that's used here for servant is unusual. It's teramon. Now, the normal word that is translated servant in the New Testament, when you see that word servant, what lies behind it is usually diakonos, which is the root word for deacon, which means servant, helper, assistant, something like that. Teromenos means a lot more than that. Well, it means more than that. It refers to a faithful attendant who voluntarily serves another. Diakonos can also be translated slave as well as servant. Teromenos cannot. It's more a title that's used, or a term that's used. It's relatively rare, apparently, from what I've read in Greek literature in general. It's usually used of a friend, sometimes of a servant in the English language sense, but the emphasis of it is voluntary service, not the service of the slave. It's making a very important distinction. And he says that, yes, Moses was faithful that way, of his own intent. He wanted to be faithful for a testimony of those things which were to be spoken after. All of Moses' faithfulness, his reception of the law, the miracles worked through him, the leading of the people out of slavery in Egypt, the leadership of the people through the 40 years in the wilderness. These, say the author of Hebrews, were all testimonies pointing forward to Jesus' greater ministry to come. This is a consistent theme in Hebrews. When he talks about right at the beginning that in olden times God spoke to our fathers through many ways. This, he's saying, this is one of the ways that God prepares the way for the coming of Christ. That he's foreshadowing greater things by the lesser things, great though they are, that he's doing through Moses. Moses was faithful in all his house, but Christ as a son over his own house. Christ is faithful as a son over his own house. Whose house are we? That's us. We are the people of God. We are the family of God. We are the house of God. If we hold fast the confidence and the rejoicing of the hope, and rejoicing of the hope firm unto the end. The word that's translated confidence here is really, 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 really interesting. Um, it occurs often in John's Gospel. It occurs frequently in the other Gospels. But its favorite word in John's Gospel, in the book of Acts, and in Paul's letters. It's a compound word. That is pa-racia. Pa means all, and racia means, you ready for this? It's the same as the root word of rhetoric. A statement quoted with resolve. It's leaving a witness that something needs to be taken seriously. It's a, as I said, very frequent New Testament word, particularly in those sources I've quoted. It's the word that lies behind these various translations. Speak boldly, speak confidently, speak openly, speak publicly, or speak with confidence. All of those are used as translations of parrhesia. And if we hold fast the confidence, all of those things, and we're going to see this word pop up, or this concept pop up again, the implication clearly being that it is not simply enough, he's saying to these who are in danger of falling away, it is not simply enough to believe. It is necessary to speak. It is necessary to speak. Yeah. Okay. Christ as the son over his own house, whose house we are. On to verse 7. For he is our God. We are the people of his pasture and the sheep of his hands. Today, if you will hear his voice, harden not your heart as in the provocation and as in the day of temptation. Remember, that means testing as well as attempting to convince. When your fathers tempted me, proved me, tested me, and saw my work. 40 years long was I grieved with this generation, and said, it is a people that do err in their heart, and they have not known my ways. Unto whom I swear in my wrath that they should not enter into my rest. Okay, what is all this about? Wow. Well, this is from the book of Numbers. I think it's in Numbers 14. And we're going to spend some time with this because it's really useful. Okay. Here's what happened at Kadesh. In chapter 13, all right, well, let's start over. People who are not terribly familiar with the Old Testament record will often look at the map and say, 40 years wandering in the wilderness? Look how short a journey it is. It's not that far. It's not that far from Egypt to Israel. Wow, 40 years. Moses must have needed a GPS. Chapter 13 says it didn't take them 40 years to get there. Only took 40 days until they got to a place called Kadesh. And at Kadesh, at Kadesh, they're in sight of the promised land. They're right on the border. And the Lord speaks unto Moses in chapter 13. And he tells them, send you men to search out the land, spies, effectively, or scouts, if you want to call it that. And he tells them precisely who to send. He says, I want you to send 12 men, one from each tribe. Okay, and he tells which ones from which tribe. Well, actually, it doesn't say. No, it says Moses chose the men. God said send one from each tribe. So he calls Joshua, okay, to lead them. And he sends him. He says, get up there, go out there and see what you see. See the land, what it is, and the people that dwelleth therein, whether they be strong or weak, few or many. And what the land is that they dwell in, whether it be good or bad, and what cities they be that they dwell in, whether in tents or in strongholds. And what the land is, whether it be fat or lean, whether that be, he wants a thorough scouting. And be of good courage and bring of the fruit of the land. Now is the time of the first grape harvest. So they went up and they searched the land. And it tells us all the places they went. And when they came unto the brook of Eshcol, they cut down from thence a branch with one cluster of grapes, and they bare it between two men upon a staff, and they brought of the pomegranates and of the figs. You may have seen pictures. It's not all that common, but you do frequently see it, of two men, one, front and back with a long stick, and there's this huge cluster of grapes on it. That's what this is a reference to. They're bringing that back. And so they come back after 40 days. 40 days to get to the river, 40 days for their scouting. To get to Kadesh, and then 40 days of scouting. So they went and came to Moses and Aaron and all the congregation, okay, to Kadesh. And they brought back word to them. They told them all they'd seen, and they showed them this huge thing of grapes and the pomegranates and the figs. And they told him, this is Moses, apparently in the presence of many others. We came unto the land whither thou sentest us, and surely it floweth with milk and honey, and this is the fruit of it. Nevertheless, the people be strong that dwell in the land, and the cities are walled and very great. And moreover, we saw the children of Anak there. The children of Anak is an infrequent reference. They're supposed to be a tribe of unusually large people, possibly even giants. The Amalekites dwell in the land of the south, and the Hittites and the Jebusites and the Amorites dwell in the mountains, and the Canaanites dwell by the sea and by the coast of Jordan. So lots of people are there, and they're all significantly strong. And Caleb, who was one of the 12, stilled the people before Moses, calmed down, and said, let us go up at once and possess it, for we are well able to overcome it. But the men that went up with him said, we be not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we. And they brought up an evil report of the land which they had searched, saying, the land through which we have gone to search it is a land that eateth up the inhabitants of thereof, and all the people that we saw in it are men of such a great stature. And there we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants, and we were in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight. And all the congregation lifted up their voice and cried, and the people wept that night. So 10 of the 12 tribal representatives are saying, we can't do this. God's led us here to take this land, but we are not capable of it. And all the children of Israel murmured against Moses and against Aaron. And the whole congregation said unto them, would God that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would God we had died in this wilderness. And wherefore hath the Lord brought us unto this land, to fall by the sword, that our wives and our children should be a prey? Were it not better for us to return into Egypt? And they said to one another, let us make a captain, in other words, somebody other than Moses, and let us return unto Egypt. This term murmured, all the children of Israel murmured against Moses. It's always translated that way in the King James. And I don't know why. Apparently it may be something literal, but here's the point. There have been books written on what's known as the murmuring tradition in Israel. It is all the times in the story of the 40 years in the wilderness, all the times that the Israelites wanted to throw off Moses as their leader and essentially reject God and embrace something else. This is one of many instances.
Like poor Netanyahu, his own people.
Yes.
They're always trying to throw it out.
Well, that's what's known as the murmur. And when you read murmured, you can take it that it's really a stronger word than it is in English. Okay, so, God's led us here, and now we're all going to die. Why don't we just go back to Egypt and resume our slavery?
Okay, where were we reading?
Pardon?
Where were we reading at this point?
Numbers chapter 14. And they said, Moses and Aaron fell on their faces before all the assembly. That sort of fell on their faces. That can mean a couple of different things. It can mean that they're imploring them, they're debasing themselves. Or it can also mean that they want to hide their faces because what they say has been blasphemous. And Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb son of Jephunneh, which were of them that searched the land, they're two of them, rent their clothes. This is what you do in the presence of blasphemy or death. It's a sign of extreme distress. And they said, that is Aaron and Caleb, said, the land which we passed through to search it is an exceeding good land. If the Lord delight in us, then he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land which floweth with milk and honey. Only rebel not ye against the Lord. They see what this is. Mm-hmm. Neither fear ye the people of the land, for they are bread for us. Their defense is departed from them, and the Lord is with us. Fear them not. They are bread for us. That's how hard a problem they are to solve. I guess it's a sign of incredible civilizational progress that we would say it would be a piece of cake. Well, cake's better than bread. Come on. But all the congregation bade stone them with stones. They want to kill them. And then the glory of the Lord, that visible manifestation, like a heavenly light, appeared in the tabernacle of the congregation before all the children of Israel. And the Lord said unto Moses, how long will this people provoke me? And how long will it be ere they believe me for all the signs which I have showed among them? God is angry. I will smite them with pestilence and disinherit them, and will make of thee a greater nation and mightier than they. He's saying this to Moses. I'm going to wipe them out, and you, Moses, I'm going to make a great nation out of you. Very similar to the promise to Abraham. I will make of you a great nation. Mm-hmm. Then Moses said unto the Lord, then, meaning if you do that, the Egyptians shall hear it, for thou broughtest up this people in thy might from among them, and they will tell it to the inhabitants of this land. For they have heard that thou, Lord, art among this people, that thou, Lord, art seen face to face, and that thy cloud, the Shekinah glory, standeth over them, and that thou goest before them by daytime, a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire by night. Now, if thou shalt kill all this people as one man, then the nations which have heard about you will say, because the Lord was not able to bring this people into the land which he sware unto them. He promised them, but he couldn't deliver. That's why. Therefore, he hath slain them in the wilderness. And so Moses says to God, I beseech thee, let the power of my Lord be great, according as thou hast spoken, saying, the Lord is long-suffering and of great mercy, forgiving iniquity and transgression, and by no means clearing the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers and the sons of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generation. Pardon, I beseech thee, Moses says to God, the iniquity of this people according to the greatness of thy mercy, and as thou hast forgiven this people from Egypt unto now. And the Lord says, okay, I'm not going to kill them all.
May I interject something here, a question? Doesn't it seem in this passage here that in a sense Moses is more judicious and wise than God? I'm bothered by that a little bit.
It sounds like Moses is talking to a child.
Perhaps, or perhaps, God is testing Moses.
Explain that.
Perhaps he's saying this to see what Moses' response will be. Does Moses think this is a good idea or not? Notice in verse 11 and verse 12, which is where he says, well, in verse 12, I will smite this. He doesn't, there's no closing seal on that, where he says, so often you will see where he says, this is what's going to be. This is the truth. This is settled. It's, and notice he says, I will, not I shall. You understand the significance of the difference?
Mm-hmm.
Will. I want to. I
But
intend to.
God is all-knowing and all-foreseeing, so he knows what he's going to do.
He knows what he's saying here is what he wants to do. Will is a statement of intention or desire. Shall is a statement that says it's going to happen. There's different. And the Lord said, I have pardoned according to thy word. But as truly as I live, all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord. They are rebellious, but God's intention to make himself known shall be fulfilled. Because all these men which have seen my glory and my miracles, which I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, and have tempted me now these 10 times, I'm not sure what that is references to, have not hearkened to my voice. Surely they shall not see the land which I swear unto their fathers, neither shall any of them that provoke me see it. But my servant Caleb, because he had another spirit with him, and have followed me fully, him will I bring unto the land, wherein he went, and his seeds shall possess it. Now, the tradition, or what goes on to happen, then he says, tomorrow turn around and go back into the wilderness. Okay? And what he says is, at some length, all of you are going to die. All of you. None of you are going to see the Holy Land. Nobody over the age of 20 who has defied me here at Kadesh is going to set foot in the Promised Land except, verse 30, Caleb and Joshua. Everybody else is going to die in the wilderness. But your children, which you said would be a prey, remember? I read it to you. Our wives and children will be a prey to the devil. Them will I bring in, and they shall know the land which ye have despised. And your children shall wander in the wilderness 40 years. I might as well go into this because it's often misunderstood if you go back and read it. Shall wander in the wilderness 40 years and bear your whoredoms until your carcasses be wasted in the wilderness. Whoredoms, sexual misconduct or sexual infidelity by a wife is very often used in the Old Testament by the prophets to describe bad behavior, and particularly bad behavior that involves worshiping other idols by the people of God. This is a reference to this long-standing image of God as Israel's husband. He's the husband, Israel's the wife. And so doing things, allowing idol worship, practicing idol worship, all this, those are infidelities, and that it's not literal. In this case, there are many references in the Old Testament, particularly to sexual misbehavior, but that's not one. And verse 34 is the key one here. After the number of the days in which ye searched the land, in other words, the number of days we were in the number of days that we were in the wilderness, but also, much more importantly, the number of the days in which the scouts were out in the promised land, even 40 days, each day for a year, shall ye bear your iniquities even 40 years, and you shall know my breach of promise. Okay, that's why 40 years in the wilderness. It's because of the rebellion at Kadesh. That is what is being referenced as the day of provocation, or as the provocation and the days of temptation in the wilderness. Their hearts were hardened. It doesn't mean that they got callous towards others. It means that they hardened their hearts in the sense that they no longer were willing to allow God's promise to predominate over their fears in their decision making. It's an important passage. Oh, and by the way, harden not your hearts as in the provocation and as in the day of temptation in the wilderness. Verse 8. The Hebrew words here are Massah and Meribah. Massah and Meribah are place names as well as common nouns, and they refer to two places where they repeated the bad behavior. Okay, I don't know. It's kind of a pun, I guess. I don't know, but it's there. It's there in the Hebrew. Take heed, brethren, lest there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief. Okay, they hardened their hearts, an evil heart. And you get it. Departing from the living God. Take heed. By the way, take heed literally means hear. Or, in the sense of really hear. Hear and take notice. But exhort one another daily while it is called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. For we are made partakers of Christ if we hold the beginning of our confidence steadfast unto the end. While it is said, today if you will hear his voice, harden not your hearts as in the provocation. For some, when they had heard, did provoke, howbeit not all that came out of Egypt by Moses, not Joshua and Caleb, but with those was he grieved 40, but with whom was he grieved 40 years? Was it not with them that had sinned, whose carcasses fell in the wilderness? And to whom sware he that they should not enter into his rest, but to them that believed not? So we see that they could not enter because of unbelief. Let us therefore fear, lest a promise being left us of entering into his rest, any of you should seem to come short of it. For unto us was the gospel preached, as well as unto them. But the word preached did not profit them, not being mixed with faith in them that heard it. For we which have believed do enter into rest. As he said, as I have sworn in my wrath, if they shall enter into my rest, though the works were finished from the foundation of the world. Now, let's talk about this bit by bit. He's talking here about, I need to jump out of Numbers for a little bit over the Psalms, and specifically Psalm 95, which he has been quoting throughout, sorry, I jumped ahead. He has been quoting throughout his treatment of what happened at Kadesh from Psalm 95. Psalm 95, the first verse will be very familiar to all of you. It's the first verse of the Penidium. Oh, come, let us sing unto the Lord. Let us heartily rejoice in the strength of our salvation. Let us come before his presence with thanksgiving and make a joyful noise unto him with psalms and so forth. Okay, look how many of, go down to verse 7 of Psalm 95, and you will see that it is so closely paralleled in Hebrews. He is our God. We are the people of his pasture and the sheep of his hand. Today, if you will hear his voice, harden not your heart as in the provocation and as in the day of temptation in the wilderness, when your fathers tempted me, proved me, and saw my work. That's 40 years long was I grieved with this generation, said it is a people that do err in their heart, and they have not known my ways, unto whom I swear in my wrath that they should not enter into my rest. That's a direct quote in Hebrew. He's back referencing the Psalms. Once again, just as the idea that's presented to us in the first verse of Moses, in past times, various ways God spake to his people, was applied to the acts of God through Moses. Similarly, he sees that God speaking to his people through the Hebrew Scriptures. And he really likes Psalms. He uses Psalms a lot. And that the speaking was not merely to the people of the Old Covenant, but was intended to be seen more clearly with the institution of the New Covenant by the sacrifice of Christ and his resurrection. It is not merely the words of the prophets that are known as prophets, that are prophecies, that are foretelling, well, I won't say foretelling, foreshadowing, maybe a better word, foreshadowing what God is going to do, and according to the Hebrews, both is going to do and already has done. Some of it is completed and accomplished, some is yet to be, to the people of the New Testament and the author of Hebrews would add, and does add, if you remain faithful. Don't fall away. Don't go back to your old ways. And that's what he's trying to keep them from doing. Take heed lest there be any of you an evil heart of unbelief, departing from the living God, but exhort one another daily, while it is called today. Today appears here and in other places. Lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. I want you to take care, brothers, to take care of yourselves and each other, not to fall away and die in the wilderness. For we are made partakers of Christ if we hold the beginning of our confidence steadfast unto the end. By the way, that whole confidence here again is parousia, not just believing but speaking. The partakers of Christ is very interesting. Obviously, there's a Eucharistic reference there. Partakers of them, we use partake to mean eat. Obviously, there's a Eucharistic reference there, but I'm pretty sure it goes a lot farther than that. It means sharing in the life of Christ, sharing in His reality, for that He may dwell in us and we in Him. If we hold the beginning of our confidence steadfast until the end. While it is said, today, if you will hear His voice, harden not your hearts as in the provocation. That's verse 95 yet again. Sorry, Psalm 95. You've got to hold fast, he's saying, because 17 and 18, those that didn't believe, those that weren't willing to act on God's promises, wound up being sent out into the wilderness until all but two were dead, and those two were Joshua and Caleb, who had not fallen away from faith. They wanted to act on God's promise and go into the promised land. Verse 4. This is next chapter. Let us therefore fear, lest, a promise being left us of entering into His rest, any of you should seem to come short of it. Two things about this verse. The first one, it's interesting. He's preaching, all right? Here's something that I always notice when I hear sermons, is how many times the preacher uses the first person pronoun and how many times he uses a second person pronoun. If he says I or me too much, I get a little worried. And secondly, that applies not only to pronouns in the singular, but in the plural. And notice here, he doesn't say to them, you better be scared. He said, let us therefore fear. He's including himself as someone who is subject to the same trials and temptations as those to whom he is preaching. Okay. Maybe. Let us therefore fear, a promise being left us only of entering into His rest. Any of you should seem to come short of it. There he seems to be saying, I'm solid. And maybe what he's saying is that he fears for them. I don't know. I just found it one of those small things. I remember attempting to learn Spanish in high school and being told that I had a very good vocabulary, but I needed to pay a lot more attention to the small words. and that's true in a lot of languages. The things like us and the difference between thee and a and all that kind of stuff, it can really change meaning. But the thing that really is important here is what he is, I believe, a phrase he's used for the first time. It's a phrase that's often directly out of the Old Testament again. Entering into his rest. Now, the concept of rest here is very significant and kind of surprising in some ways. Okay. I remember hearing someone preaching a long time ago. Someone from a sermon I heard many years ago, and it never left my mind. There's someone saying, people who think that what we are promised as Christians is an easy life really miss the mark very badly. And people who talk about, oh, I'm spending years in the wilderness, really, the preacher said, made him tired. He said, read the Old Testament. In the wilderness, they were there for 40 years, and God gave them everything they needed. And you know how many battles they fought in 40 years? One. As soon as they cross into the promised land, it's tooth and nail. From there on, they have to fight. They can't get into the promised land until they take Jericho. And much of the sacred history of Israel after that time has to do with warfare. They fight offensively and they fight defensively. May make it seem odd that the term being used here for entering into the promised land is entering into his rest. It's not restful as we know rest. Not at all. It's very reminiscent to me of Jesus saying to his disciples, peace I give unto you, not as the world do I give. My peace I give unto you. It's not outward peace. It's peace with God. And in this case, it's not outward rest. They're going to have to work. God's going to cut off the manna as soon as they get in there. They're going to have to work for a living from then on. Rest here, the rest that is to be attained by settlement in Canaan, is resting in the promises of God, trusting in the promises of God. And there is a secondary meaning for the word, and the meaning is dwelling or habitation. We even use this in English, in kind of archaicized English. You know, somebody, I can't think of one right at the moment, but somebody here probably can. The formula noun, proper noun or common noun in the possessive sense, like Randolph's rest, a term that's applied to dwelling places. Somebody I'm sure can think of one, but I can't at the moment. For we which have believed do enter into rest, as he said, as I have sworn in my wrath, if they shall enter into my rest. So the works were finished from the foundation of the world. Notice the tense. Not we who have believed shall enter into rest, but we which have believed do enter into rest. What he's saying is that those who believe in God's promises and put their trust in him rather than their own evaluations and so forth, like Joshua and Caleb, they are already into a relationship with God. They are already resting in God, even though they may be at odds with many other things and many other people. Though the works were finished from the foundation of the world. I have struggled with that, and I'm not sure what it means. Sorry. I wish I could be better about this. Although the works were finished from the foundation of the world, I cannot puzzle it out to my satisfaction. Sir.
About God's rest, were you thinking about abode, abide, those kinds of
Exactly.
words?
Yeah. Thank you. That's a better English cognate than anything I came up with. As in abide with me, which means both stay and live. Yeah. Well, we use that same term. English has as many slippery words as Greek does. It's just that because we use them all the time, we know what we mean. Okay? You know, if I say to you, I know a guy living in Canada, you know that I don't just mean that he's not dead yet, that he has life in his body. I mean that he's making his home there. And you know that. I don't have to tell you that. Even though if you look it up in a dictionary, it's multiple meanings. Of course, if I do know a guy living in Canada, he is living in Canada as well. See, I told you we could be slippery. If anybody has any ideas about this, I'd love to hear them. Although the works were finished from the foundation of the world.
Does this read, just what you said earlier in the lesson, Father, when you talked about the difference between will and shall? God knows that certain things are going to
Occur.
Yeah, and so he sees them. They're in his mind. They're finished because he sees they're going to happen. They shall happen. Is it?
That's one. That's certainly a legitimate reading, and it's been used that way by predestinarians. But I got to admit, you've heard me say this before. Probably all of you have heard me say it before. I really can't accept predestination for the same reasons that Dr. Samuel Johnson said he couldn't. He said all theory is for it, but all experience is against it. I know I can say I agonized over this decision. I didn't even know what I was going to do. I made up my mind and I did it. Obviously, that wasn't predestined. And then the answer from the predestinarian will be, well, all the agonizing was predestined too. The whole question of how God deals with the world and how he deals with us. I believe very, very strongly that God gives us free will. And that the decisions that we make and the actions that we take, this is that linear view of history thing again. The decisions that we make and the actions that we take change things. That we're not just following a script that's been written somewhere inside us, and we're like player pianos where the keys are moving, but our fingers don't matter. I can't believe that. Now, it may be, I may be wrong. I don't pretend to perfect knowledge, but I have to make, in my mind, I have to make decisions about what I believe in order to make sense of the rest of what I believe or don't believe. For he spake in a certain place. This actually is a mildly humorous reference. Because, of course, what he's speaking of is a creation story in Genesis. He's speaking originally to a Hebrew group, whoever they are, they're Jewish, right? Saying, well, in a certain place is like every child above the age of 9 would know that by heart. The creation story, that is. So this is sort of a mildly human, like, sort of, yeah, I can't quite remember, but yeah, y'all probably know. You know, that sort of thing. And here's something very interesting. He spake in a certain place of the 7th day on this wise, and God did rest the 7th day from all his works. And in this place again, if they shall enter into my rest. Now, here's an interesting thing about Genesis 1 and 2. In the creation myth in Genesis 1 and 2, there are 6 days of creation. And after each of those days, the same phrase appears over and over and over, every single time. And the phrase is, and the evening and the morning were the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, or 6th day. The next verse is, and on the 7th day God rested. But it does not say, and the evening and the morning were the next day. The implication is, or at least one possible implication, and I'm still exploring what this means in my own head. The implication is that the 7th day has not yet ended, that we are in the 7th day. Now, this would not square the idea that God rested on the 7th day. This would not square with the idea of rest as ceasing from working. Because clearly, the biblical record is God's doing a lot of work and has done a lot of work since creation. So it's not rest in that sense. So what is his rest? It's a big question. It can be, obviously, it can mean a cessation of labor from a given task, but I'm not sure that it can mean a cessation of labor from all tasks. Certainly in God's case, it does not. Seeing therefore it remaineth that some must enter therein. In other words, some of us are going to get into the promised land. And they to whom it was first preached entered not in because of unbelief. Again, he limiteth. Now oh boy, this is a translation that really needs to be spoken up. Partly because I really like the etymology. The word translated as limited, or limited, is orizo, or orizo, I'm not sure of the pronunciation. And it doesn't mean put a top on. It means to mark off by boundary, to determine the extent of. So it does, in a sense, mean a limit, but it's not it's more a question of defining what's inside the limit rather than preventing one entering what's outside the limit. You know what it's the root word of? Horizon. That's the limit of our sight. We can see that far. We can see everything from here to there, but we can't see beyond that. So he defines or marks off by boundaries, saying to David, today, after so long a time, as it is said, today, if you will hear his voice, hearken not your hearts. Harden not your hearts. Think about this idea of the 7th day as all time from the end of creation until the present. And it really changes how you read so much of these texts. because the word today appears so often. If it is not being understood simply as a 24-hour period, or even as a certain period in the past, like in King David's day or in Julius Caesar's day. If it means the age in which we have been living since the beginning, that really changes the depth of meaning, adds more depth to the meaning in a lot of these passages. For if Jesus had given them rest, now he's using Jesus here not in terms of the incarnate Jesus. He's using it as Jesus as God. Then would he not afterward have spoken of another day? Then would he, that's not a question, it's a statement. Then would he not afterward have spoken of another day? Them are the people of the old covenant. Now God promised to give them rest when they came that they would come into the promised land and he would give them rest. Many of them fell away, but their children, their descendants, I mean, there were 40 years, I'm sure there were more than just children, their descendants and Joshua and Caleb did enter into the Holy Land. They did enter into the rest that had been promised them, but that promise was a foreshadowing of a greater promise. Oh, by the way, I neglected to mention this. Moses didn't get in either.
Mm-hmm.
Moses dies just before they enter into the Holy Land. And this is announced as because of his disobedience, despite all of his many obediences, his disobedience when at Meribah, remember Meribah, it's a place as well as, in Meribah, the people were once again murmuring, we're going to die in the wilderness, because they didn't have anything to drink. And God says to him, speak to the stone, and it will spring forth water. And Moses doesn't speak to it. He hits it with a stick instead. Yeah, you know your stuff. And because of that. But in the early church, when so many members of the early church were Greek fluent, at least in Koine, this was seen as yet another sign. Because remember, Joshua and Jesus are the same name. It's Yeshua in Hebrew and Aramaic. And one is transliterated into English through the Hebrew, Joshua, and the other is transliterated into English through the Greek, Jesus. All right? So it was seen by many as a sign that God wanted to say that the old covenant will be fulfilled, or the old covenant will be honored, but the one who will actually lead you in to the promise that lies behind it is not the one who accepted the covenant with the law, that is Moses, but it would be rather one who's named Yeshua. Okay. Yeah, there's a lot of complexity here. There remaineth therefore a rest to the people of God. There's another rest to come. For he that is entered into his rest, he also has ceased from his own works, as God did from his. So there's more rest to come. Let us labor, therefore, to enter into that rest, lest any man fall after the example, same example of unbelief. So this apparent contradiction that God rested on the unending seventh day but is still active in the world has been dealt with, I think, interestingly, by a man named Luke Timothy Johnson. Y'all heard of him? He's probably he's probably the best living scholar. I think he's still alive. He's probably the best living English language scholar of the Gospel of St. Luke. So I guess he chose it because Luke. He's also a Benedictine monk, very distinguished. Taught at the Candler School of Theology and also at Emory University. And I mean, he's big time, and he writes well. I don't agree with him on everything because he's wrong on some stuff, but he writes very well, and he really is very useful. So Luke Timothy Johnson, remember that word. He said that God's activity in the world and the activity to which we are called is no longer a striving to fill a need, but to share in the outpouring of an abundant life. It's a nice phrase, and the more I think about it, the more sense I make. Although I must admit that my admiration for Luke Timothy Johnson does not rest as much on that particular phrase, but on another one, which I hope will indicate to you some of my disapproval of many, many, many modern translations. He said, and I love this phrase, it is a form of generational narcissism to change text to suit one's own needs.
Oh my goodness, that imagery.
Isn't that nice? Yeah. I love that. Okay. For the word of God is quick and powerful and sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing even to the dividing asunder of soul and spirit and of the joints and marrow, and is a discerner of the thoughts and intents of the heart. Yeah. Okay. Much depth here. There is so much emphasis in the text of Hebrews on the concepts of word, the concepts of speaking, the concepts of hearing, the concepts of listening, that anytime he uses it, it's reinforced by all the other things he said. And the word of God here can be taken to mean either scripture or prophecy or Christ himself, the Logos. In the beginning was the Word. I've told you that Hebrews runs very well in tandem with John. John's Gospels, the most theological of the Gospels, and they're echoes of each in the other. Sharper than any two-edged sword. Now, as I've said quite a few times, with regard to what's written in those days, there are not a lot of superfluous words. They tend to be sparing with their words. Doesn't seem like it when you're going through one of those interminable sentences in Paul. But generally speaking, you better pay attention to every word. And one question is, why two-edged? Why does it need to say two-edged sword? Sword would do just as well, unless he means something by two-edged. And there are a lot of different interpretations of this. Personally, the one that strikes me as being most in line with what I've come to feel about Hebrews so far, and think about Hebrews, much more importantly than feel. The two edges, it seems to me, the two edges, it seems to me, refer to the two covenants, the old and the new. They're sharp, and they do pierce. But the Word of God is more powerful and sharper. This idea that God is continuing to be at work in the world, that God is continuing to be at work in us, that He has not simply left us some instruction books, that He's working, that He's present. I think that's what's intended by the use of the two-edged sword. Piercing even to the dividing asunder of soul and spirit. Now, man, that's a tough one, okay? I will agree. We tend to have great difficulty in defining what we mean by soul in particular. The best definition I've ever heard, again, Fitz Allison, thank you, Fitz. He said, after struggling with it for some time and presenting lots of possibilities, he said, the soul is what we mean when we say, I. It's not just your body. It's you. And there's a connection between body and soul, body and identity, body and I. I got a little cut messing around with a knife and some cutting up that pork last. I can tell you either I cut my finger or I can tell you I cut myself. There's a difference, but not much of a difference. Okay? The difference is if I cut that finger off, I could still say I could still say me. And I think that's not a bad way to think of it. Soul is me. Okay? Soul is not me. Soul is what I mean when I say me or I. And the soul is present by nature in every human being. But the spirit is not. The spirit, for Christians, the spirit comes from God by His Holy Spirit that dwelleth in us. And the Word of God is a discerner of the thoughts and intents of the heart. The word discerner here, there's a little word study. I know y'all get tired of these, but they're how I define, they're how I find meaning. The Greek word is kritikos. It's the word we use for critic. It's the word critic from which critic derives. In the Septuagint, we're back to the Septuagint, it's used to translate the word shofet from Hebrew. Shofet is the word that's used for a judge. A judger of the thoughts and intents of the heart. Not just see, but do. Evaluate. And it's interesting, shofet, judge, that's how it's usually translated. Actually, it's a complicated form that literally means worthy or capable of judging. And it's important to remember that the Hebrew shofet, the judge, is not a judge in the modern sense, or even in the Roman sense, of someone who makes decisions based on law. The root idea of judgment is not punishment or reward. The root of it is bringing back into harmony, bringing back into balance. This gets very complicated when you go into the Greek language background because there had been so much philosophical speculation from Socrates, at least from Socrates on, about the nature of justice and the nature of judgment. what it was for, how it should be done. You cannot, it's a whole area of philosophical study. And to say that the Word of God is the kritikos is to say both that He is capable and able not only to know the thoughts and intents of the human heart, but to set them right, to bring them back to what they should be. The judge is the one who straightens things out. If you spent much time with the book of Judges, you'll know that in the book of Judges, most of what the judges do, they're not putting on black robes and hearing lawyers talk. What they're doing is being out in the world, fixing things that are broken and righting wrongs that have been done. They are active, they're leaders. They're not simply referees. Neither is there any creature that is not manifest in His sight. But all things are naked and opened unto the eyes of Him with whom we have to do. Almighty God, unto whom all hearts are open. Okay, and all the rest, yeah, that's seeing them, that we have a great high priest that is passed into the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our profession. Interesting how we derive words from other languages. The word confession comes from confideo, with faith. Confidence is the same root. But here, confession refers to another word. It comes from profitere, which is to publicly declare. It's used here.
A little bit louder.
Pardon me?
Just a little bit louder.
It's used here to define from the Septuagint a Greek word that's really interesting, homologios. And you would think, because it's logios, that it comes from logos, but it doesn't. It comes from lego. I love this bit. I love this stuff. Words are things. Homo means the same, together, the same, okay? And lego is a very old word. Homer uses it actually, which means to lie down with the intention of sleeping. But it came to be used in the same way that we use it in English. Used later in the language of rhetoric of laying an argument to rest. That is, bringing a message to closure. And we use the same thing when we say things have been laid to rest. I mean, what did the attorney do? In a criminal trial? The defense rests, all right? We lay it to rest. And it's wow. I just love the way these words come about. And it comes to refer to this term, homologios, comes to refer to a conclusion embraced by a common confession, what we would call a profession or an affirmation. We still use the word that way in some respects. When a novice enters into full orders in a religious order, that's called a profession of faith, and it was used in koine in Greek as a term that could be applied in Greek to contracts. It was a common affirmation. So it's really, it's a word with a lot of depth to it. But that's not the most important thing here. Here's the most important thing. This is the third reference to Jesus as high priest. of course, back reference to the, what you call it, to temple worship. But it's the first time that he has used the phrase great high priest. It's different. That is passed into the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Okay, I've got about 15 minutes more worth of material. Do you want me to do it now or quit? I can start with this next week. Nobody's talking.
Let's not lose our train of thought.
All right. Talk me right into it, you silver-tongued devil. That is passed into the heavens. Now we got to go back to the temple in Jerusalem. You remember the temple in Jerusalem had a series of areas. Anybody could enter the first, the court of the Gentiles. Only, then there was the court of Israel, and that was limited. And then there was the court of the priest, and that was limited. And then there was the Holy of Holies. Okay. Well, actually, there's something else in between. I forget what it was called. But the Holy of Holies was separated from the rest of the Jerusalem temple. And it was only entered once a year by the high priest on Yom Kippur. And there will be a specific reference to that later in Hebrews, so I'm not going to go through all of it now. But between the holy place, that's what it was called, the holy place, which is where the altar of incense was. Between that and the Holy of Holies was a curtain. It was a large curtain. It was 60 feet high, 4 inches thick, woven from 4 colors, symbolizing the 4 elements of creation, earth, air, water, fire, and included images. This is unusual in Hebrew, in that, you know, given the argument against images was unusual. Images of, among other things, the heavenly bodies, sun, moon, stars, and also 2 cherubim. The cherubim are the guards of God's throne. When you pass through or behind, more likely, when you pass behind that curtain, or when the high priest did, what he came into was the Holy of Holies. The Holy of Holies included the Ark of the Covenant. And on top of the Ark of the Covenant was something else, which I'll speak of in a couple of moments. The Ark of the Covenant I think I've said enough about the Ark. I'll get to what it was later. What was on top of it later. The point is, he has said that is passed into the heavens. The Ark of the Covenant represented the throne of God. Passing through that veil was represented as passing through a symbolic boundary between this earth and heaven. And only the high priest could do it. And you see, Jesus has passed into that. For we have not an high priest which cannot be touched with the feeling of our infirmities, but was in all points tempted like as we are, yet without sin. Referencing again the humanity of Christ. Let us therefore come boldly unto the throne of grace. The thing that rested on the top of the Ark of the Covenant, what was it called? A caparette. It was a rectangular cover that sat on top of the Ark. Now the Ark was closed. It was made of wood. But on top of it was this golden cover with two statues of cherubim facing each other. The cherubim were the guardians of the throne of God. This was God's throne. This was where God sat. That's how it's referred to in the Old Testament. This is God's throne room. And that throne was known as the seat of mercy, or the mercy seat, sometimes in the Old Testament. Jesus has passed through that. Let us therefore come boldly unto the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in times of need. And Father John, a couple of weeks ago, gave, I think, maybe it was longer than a couple of weeks ago, about the best thing I've heard said about grace and mercy. I forget who he was quoting, so I'm going to attribute it to him. He said, grace is when God gives you what you don't deserve. And mercy is when God doesn't give you what you do deserve. It's easy to remember and it makes good sense. And he's referencing this as a way to understand what Jesus is and what he does. He has passed through the veil. He has gone through the veil. He has passed from earth into heaven. And therefore, we are able to do the same. Because we share in his life and because he is with us. All three of the four Gospels make reference to the fact. They use the phrase, the veil of the temple was torn asunder following Christ's crucifixion, meaning it's no longer a barrier to us. It's no longer closed off.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we're going to hear a lot more about how Jesus' ministry can be understood as by understanding the Old Testament ministry. We can, by the sense in which, how can I put this? The sense in which the Old Testament rituals and ceremonies of the temple are yet another way in which God foreshadowed the perfect ministry of Christ. And it's going to be, I find it both intellectually and spiritually very convicting. What else? Okay. That's good enough. All right. Well, it didn't quite take 15 minutes, so I wasn't quite as bad as I thought it was. Thank you for allowing me to continue. Now, we're going to hear a lot more about all of this. I know it may seem hard to believe, given that we've gone into a lot of complicated things and made a lot of back references to other scriptures. But we really only just laid the foundation. We've gotten through, 4 chapters? Maybe
Tremendously interesting. It's
Yeah.
tremendously interesting.
We've gotten through 3 or 4 chapters here. And there aren't that many chapters in here. There's 14 chapters. But it's going to get, I think, that Hebrews is written in such a manner that you have to keep back referencing because you keep getting new, different, or deeper insights into what was the foundation that was being laid. And that's very much the way he sees his relationship, or our relationship with the Old Testament. That a foundation was laid, and we are only now learning more and more what was built on that foundation and is continuing to be built. I'm really enjoying this. Thank you for making it possible by being here. I mean, I know I could have done it on my own, but I'm too lazy. And again, I do apologize for being late this evening. I would like to say it was unavoidable. It was not. If I had left earlier, I would have avoided it. So, my fault.